Well, hey, have you ever heard of the term nepotism? Since you can't answer through the camera, I'm just going to assume you haven't. And if you have, then maybe it'll be a little bit of a repeat. But nepotism is a word that's used to describe people who give favor to someone else just because they're biologically related to that person. So if you're a government official and you have a huge highway job to do and your brother just happens to have some kind of a paving company and you hire him instead of somebody else who's more qualified, it's called nepotism. And this is something that has been done a lot in our society, and there's a lot of flack for people who do that. And this week, we're going to be talking about the parable of the sower. And just before the parable of the sower, we see this really interesting conversation that Jesus has with someone who's bringing news to him saying, hey, your family's outside. It's so busy in here. There's so many people around and your family's trying to get to you. And I just want you to hear what Jesus says, because of what Jesus says, there's hope for you and I. There's hope that our lives can be impacted by this message that Jesus came to bring. In Matthew chapter 12, verses 46 through 48, it says, while Jesus was still talking to the crowd, his mother and brothers stood outside wanting to speak to him. Someone told him, your mother and brothers are standing outside wanting to speak to you. He replied to them, who is my mother and who are my brothers? Pointing to his disciples, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. Now this gives so much hope, because what Jesus is saying to this crowd, he's got this crowd of people, he's got so many people in front of him that his mother and brothers can't even get in to talk to him. And so they send someone else and say, hey, can you bring Jesus out to us? And Jesus says something that could at first be taken as rude. Like, why would you give this kind of a response to your family? But if you think about what Jesus is saying here, it means that there's hope for all of us. There's so much hope, because he looks at the crowd and he says, who are my mother and my brothers and my sisters? He says, those that do the will of the Father, those are my mother and my brother and my sisters. And what Jesus is saying is that we don't get to be in the family of God because of some blood biological relation. If your father or mother is a pastor or a missionary, or you grew up in a Christian home, that doesn't mean that you're a Christian or a follower of Christ. And it doesn't mean that you can have hope for eternal life with Jesus. And the reason this is good news is because Jesus is saying this message is actually open for all. It's open for anyone who believes. And so the reason that you and I can have hope for eternal life with Jesus is if we believe his message, if we accept it. And this is incredible news. And so this is just before the parable of the sower, which is basically the most important parable Jesus ever speaks. Because at one point when he's talking about this parable, he says, well, if you don't understand this parable, then how could you understand any? And I just want you to listen to the way this ends. We're going to get into this parable on Sunday, but the way that this parable ends is really powerful. It's in Matthew chapter 13, verse 23, and this is the end of it, where he's talking about the seed that fell on good soil. It says, but the seed falling on good soil refers to someone who hears the word and understands it. And you're going to see this coming Sunday. Jesus compares good soil with bad soil. And the way that we can know whether our hearts are good soil is if we believe the message of Jesus, if we receive it with our whole hearts. So regardless of your background, regardless of whether you've got all kinds of horrible things in your background or bad family history, there's hope for you if you believe and receive the message of Jesus Christ.